So, when you think of the roaring 20s, what's the first thing that pops into your head? For most of us, it's, flappers, jazz clubs, those endless parties with champagne flowing. We picture it as this one big, glamorous celebration, right? But here's the thing. Underneath all that noise, all that prosperity, there was something else. A tremor. A deep, deep instability that tells a much more complex and, honestly, way more fascinating story.
And yeah, on the surface, the 20s were just an absolute explosion of energy. I mean, think about it. After the nightmare of World War I, America kind of turned inward. It was all about rebuilding, and maybe even more than that, it was about spending. This brand new culture of consumerism just grabbed hold and basically created the blueprint for the economy we have today. Suddenly, things like cars and radios, they weren't just toys for the super wealthy anymore. This was the jazz age, a boom in culture, a total shift in values, and this really seductive feeling, that the party was just never going to stop.
So, that brings us to the big question, right? It's the whole point of this. If the 20s were this incredible high point, how on earth did they lead directly into the absolute lowest point in modern American history, the Great Depression? What was really going on beneath all that glitter and gold? Okay, so to start digging for an answer, we've got to follow the money. The economic boom of the 1920s, it was absolutely real, don't get me wrong, but the foundation it was built on, well, that was shockingly unstable. You could say it was less of a solid boom and more of a really, really fragile bubble, just waiting to pop. So how did this whole thing even happen? Well, you've got soldiers coming home from the war, right? Factories switch from making war materials back to making stuff for regular people. Then, businesses just unleash this massive wave of advertising, telling literally everyone to spend, spend, spend. And all of this was supercharged by new ways to buy things and this absolute fever in the stock market. It felt like a ride that only went up, and it convinced millions of people they could get rich and get rich fast.
One of the biggest game changers was something called the installment plan. Honestly, you can just think of it as the great granddaddy of the credit card. All of a sudden, you didn't need a pile of cash to buy a new car or the latest radio. It was revolutionary. But, and this is a huge but, it also meant that for the very first time, tons of American families started going deep, deep into debt. It kicked off that whole buy now, pay later cycle that, let's be real, is still a huge part of our economy.
And the ultimate symbol of all this optimism, oh, for sure, was the stock market. It just kept climbing. I mean, up and up and up. People weren't just investing their savings anymore, they were speculating, basically gambling on stocks, often with borrowed money, because everyone believed the ride would never end. It created this immense wealth, at least on paper, but it was so, so risky. So you end up with this really powerful contrast, right? On one side, you have this nationwide belief, this promise that, hey, this prosperity is here to stay. It's permanent. But on the other side, you have the cold, hard reality that the entire system was basically a house of cards, built on a mountain of personal debt and just wild speculation. But the economy, that's only half the picture. At the exact same time, the social fabric of the country was being pulled in two completely opposite directions. It was a decade of this incredible cultural renaissance, but also a decade of deep, gnawing fear and a really violent backlash. It was a culture war. And frankly, you can still hear the echoes of it in our politics today. A huge driver of this change was something called the Great Migration. We're talking millions of African Americans leaving the rural South, heading for the industrial cities up north. They were looking for opportunity, sure, but they were also escaping the brutality of Jim Crow. And this massive shift in population, well, it would light the fuse for one of the most important cultural movements in all of American history. And this right here, this visual, it just perfectly captures that central conflict of the 1920s. On one hand, you've got this creative, vibrant, unbelievable explosion of Black culture, and on the other, you have the terrifying resurgence of an organized nationwide movement built on white supremacy and nativism. These two things weren't just happening at the same time, they were in direct and often violent opposition to each other. I mean, the Harlem Renaissance was just a true golden age. In places like Harlem, you saw this flourishing of art, music, and literature that was just unprecedented. This is the time of incredible minds like Langston Hughes, Zora Neale Hurston, and musical geniuses like Duke Ellington. It was literally the birth of the Jazz Age, a sound that would go on to define the entire century. And yet, at the exact same moment, All of that amazing progress triggered an equal and opposite reaction. But fear spreads as well. And that fear of change, fear of new ideas, fear of new people, it fueled a powerful and very, very organized backlash.
This backlash really took a lot of different forms. You had the first Red Scare, which led to raids and deportations of anyone even suspected of being a communist or an anarchist. The Ku Klux Klan, which had mostly faded away after the Civil War, was reborn and swelled to millions of members across the entire country, spreading this toxic message of racism and nativism, which is basically just a fierce anti-immigrant ideology. And then, then there was Prohibition.
So the idea behind Prohibition, the goal, was to create this more moral, more orderly society by just banning alcohol completely. The reality? It did the exact opposite. It created a massive black market, which fueled the rise of notorious gangsters like Al Capone. It basically turned millions of otherwise normal people into lawbreakers. It's just a perfect example of the contradictions of the decade.
Okay, so let's put the pieces together. We've got two big ones: a dangerously unstable economy and a society completely fractured by these deep cultural tensions. When you put those two things together, you start to see that the crash wasn't just, a possibility, it was pretty much inevitable. And that's the key. These weren't separate issues. They were a recipe for total disaster. You have this financial system teetering on a shaky foundation of speculation and debt, and it's all happening inside a country that's just deeply divided by social and racial conflict. The stage was absolutely being set for a perfect storm.
And that's really the main takeaway here. The Great Depression didn't just pop up out of nowhere in 1929. The cracks in the foundation, they were there the whole time, all through that supposedly roaring decade. The party was just so loud that nobody could hear the floorboards starting to splinter underneath their feet.
Which kind of leaves us with one last thought to chew on. The story of the 1920s. It's a really powerful lesson, isn't it? It's about looking past the shiny surface of things. It forces us to ask a tough question. In any era of big prosperity and rapid change, including our own, is it possible that we're mistaking the roar of a party for the shaking of the foundation?